For decades, I've wandered through the environmental milieu, the diverse venues wherein environmentally engaged individuals and groups encounter and influence one another. I've interviewed hundreds of Greens, tracked the writers and scientists, activists and artists, and a host of others, learning who and what has inspired them. I've read scores of historical and social scientific studies that address the research question that has long preoccupied my attention. What might mobilize our species to respond effectively to slow and halt the accelerating anthropogenic reduction of Earth's biocultural diversity? I've learned that feelings of kinship with species other than our own often animate pro-environmental behaviors. These feelings are integrated into an overall worldview or cosmovision that includes a cosmogony, in other words, an understanding of how the world came to be the way it is, perceptions of belonging to nature, humility about the human place in the world, convictions that all living things have intrinsic value, as well as love and loyalty to the earth and its living systems. There are many specific experiences and insights that lead to dark green worldviews, as I've come to call them. Such understandings, which are found widely within the global environmental milieu, where pro-environmental actors meet in and influence one another, typically involve these traits and characteristics: a belief that nature itself is sacred, and that all living things have intrinsic value and deserve respect and reverence, and that all living things share a common ancestor and thus are kin. Also typical is an ecology-based understanding that all life is interconnected and mutually dependent, and these beliefs are woven in with deep feelings of belonging and connection to nature and a corresponding humility about the human place in the world, and experiences of awe and wonder at the terror and beauties of the universe, and feelings of love toward nature and its denizens, all of which culminate in a desire to protect all beings and the ecosystems to which they belong and upon which they depend. These dark green spiritualities assume diverse forms. Some are traditionally religious and involve beliefs in supernatural divine beings. Others are entirely naturalistic and involve no such beliefs. Most have affinity with animistic perceptions and Gaian organicist understandings. Those who find their way to such understandings do so via three main paths, namely through the senses, through the arts, and through the sciences. These paths are not separate, however. They weave back and forth in reciprocally influential ways through the lives of individuals and groups. Direct, visceral sensory experiences in nature, including experiences of awe and wonder at the beauties, mysteries, and sometimes terror of nature, especially through personal encounters with non-human organisms, are a common pathway to kinship sentiments and ethics. A classic example was provided when John Muir, exulting in the beauty and power of nature and enraptured with various plants and animals, wrote that through such experiences, we feel ourselves a part of wild nature, kin to everything. Another experience that often leads to kinship sentiments and transpires when someone looks into the eyes of a non-human animal. The primatologist Jane Goodall, for example, felt a deep sense of connection looking into the eyes of a male chimpanzee whom she named David Greybeard, which seemed a gateway to his gentle personality. Further illustrating how the eyes convey agency, intelligence, and value, Goodall has often related the story of a man who witnessed a chimpanzee who had recently been introduced into a zoo enclosure, escaping an attack by other chimpanzees, only to end up drowning in a water-filled moat. Looking into the distressed chimpanzee's eyes, the man perceived an appeal for help and risked his own life to save the chimp. The ethologist Mark Beckhoff, with whom Goodall has often collaborated, had a similar revelation when told to kill a cat as part of a laboratory experiment. When Beckhoff gazed into the cat's eyes, however, he thought that the cat knew what was coming and plaintively asked, "Why me?" Beckhoff continued, based on this experience, "There's no more direct animal-to-animal communication than staring deeply into another's eyes." Such experiences are so common, awakening concern for animals and often the ecosystems they depend upon, that I've termed them eye-to-eye epiphanies. Like Goodall and Beckhoff, many other ethologists, including Carl Safina and Jeff Mason, blend personal experiences with their science when expressing and promoting kinship feelings. Scores of artists seek to evoke and reinforce kinship with non-human organisms and environmental systems, not uncommonly by expressing kinship feelings first experienced through sensory encounters with other species. Among the diverse artistic methods are nature photography, documentaries, motion pictures, painting, sculpture, novels, and poetry. An apt example is Franz Lanting's Eye-to-Eye, Intimate Encounters with the Animal World, a large book replete with stunning photographs of animal eyes. In the introduction, Lanting explained how his path to photographic conservation began with a book he read as a child, The Wonderful Adventures of Nils, by the Swedish Nobel Prize-winning author Selma Lagerlöf. First published in 1907, the story is about a boy named Nils who was magically shrunk to the size of an elf and lived for a year with a family of geese. When he returned to his human size, however, the geese became afraid of him. Nevertheless, the geese urged Nils to become an advocate for them in the human world. Lanting explained that this story kindled his ability to see the world through other eyes and to celebrate the kinship of all life. Here are two more images from Lanting's evocative book. I experienced another example during a conference sponsored by Partners in Flight, an organization of ornithologists and conservationists concerned about declining bird populations in the Americas. The conference's theme, Tundra to Tropics, Connecting Birds, Habitats, and People, and my keynote focusing on science and spirituality, both reflected the spiritual sentiments of the organizers and their felt kinship with winged life. So did an evening plenary that was titled, Using the Power of Birds to Awaken Consciousness. The event fused bird-focused poetry and myths and evocative music blending human and bird song with stunning photographs of bird eyes. The creators behind the performance explained that their intention was to promote interspecies kinship and awaken the connections between humans and the universe. The artistic expression of our relationships with other species is nothing new. Although we should be humble when speculating, it seems to me that at the very dawn of art, humans were wrestling with their relationships with non-human animals, as they were, apparently, in this cave art from Borneo dated 40,000 years ago, as well as in paintings in the Chauvet Cave in southern France, which were produced about 35,000 years ago. Although Chauvet had no paintings of complete human figures, it did have many animals, which demonstrates that these early humans were preoccupied with their most immediate co-inhabitants. All these images, including in the famous Lascaux cave, suggest in a way that we can only imagine that these artists had intimate relationships with the animals they depended upon, feared, and possibly venerated or worshipped. Images and related stories showing blurry lines between humans and other species are common around the world in folk and indigenous cultures, a topic beyond the current purpose. Here I will simply note that the artists from diverse traditions, including those in predominantly Christian cultures, have also showed close connections between humans and other beings, as exemplified by Hudson River School painter Edward Hick, who in this image depicted Noah saving the animals. And in this painting, from his Peaceable Kingdom series, Hicks expressed an eschatological hope that predators and prey would eventually become family in a peaceable kingdom. The sciences, especially astronomy and cosmology, ecology and botany, and evolution and ethology, provide powerful testimony to the kinship of all life. Charles Darwin presaged scientific kinship understandings with these seldom quoted words. If we choose to let conjecture run wild, then animals, our fellow brethren in pain, diseases, death, suffering, and famine, our slaves in our most laborious works, our companions in our amusements, they may partake of our origin in one common ancestor. We may be all netted together. Darwin's suggestion that we empathize with other animals was rooted in an understanding of ecological interdependence, as well as his then emerging understanding of biological kinship. Not long afterward, Ernst Haeckel began artistically illustrating biological kinship with his depictions of evolution as a tree of life, in which all organisms are shown to be biologically related. That this tree of life includes our own species became clear in this 1879 version, which he subtitled The Pedigree of Man. Others would pick up on Darwin's suggestion and evolutionary understandings to draw out the moral implication of the struggle for existence and biological kinship. During the 1920s, for example, Albert Schweitzer first advanced his ethics of reverence for life, for which in 1952 he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Schweitzer rooted his ethics in part on a Darwinian recognition of and empathy for all living things who struggle for existence. For Schweitzer, feeling kinship with them in this struggle and sharing with all other organisms a will to live meant that morality simply involves the saving or helping of life. It was ecologist Aldo Leopold, however, who specifically argued that an understanding of evolution should lead to felt kinship with other organisms and a broad environmental ethics. In a Sand County Almanac, which was posthumously published in 1949, Leopold wrote, "It's a century now since Darwin gave us the first glimpse of the origin of species. We know now what was unknown to all the preceding caravan of generations, that men are only fellow creatures with other creatures in the odyssey of evolution." This new knowledge should have given us a sense of kinship with fellow creatures, a wish to live and let live, a sense of wonder over the biotic enterprise. Such an understanding, according to Leopold, is the result of social evolution, which is an intellectual as well as an emotional process. Leopold saw social evolution leading many to understand themselves as plain members and citizens of the biotic community, while awakening love, respect, and admiration for entire ecosystems. Leopold was not basing his ethics on science alone. It had been kindled by an eye-to-eye encounter with a wolf. With engaging prose, which is itself a form of art, Leopold related how, as a young man, he shot a female wolf, reaching her in time to watch the green fire dying in her eyes. The experience, he later explained, was a turning point toward appreciating the value of predators and of entire ecosystems. I wonder if Leopold would have arrived at his evolutionary kinship ethics had he not had that sensory eye-to-eye epiphany with that wolf. Many others have deduced kinship ethics from scientific understandings. In 1979, biologist E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia for his theory that human beings have an evolution-derived innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. According to Wilson, biophilia often involves profound appreciation for nature. Science, for its part, according to Wilson, teaches that we are literally kin to other organisms and that our differences are only a matter of degree. For Wilson, this understanding ought to redound in pro-environmental behavior. The field of conservation biology, which also emerged during the late 1970s, both exemplifies how experiences of kinship with non-human organisms and feelings of belonging to nature motivates many environmental scientists, while lending credence to the notion of biophilia as well. For example, Michael Soule, who was one of the founders of the discipline, wrote, "There is now no question that all life on Earth evolved from a common ancestor. Every living kind of plant and animal owes its existence to a single-celled ancestor that evolved some 3.5 billion years ago. All species are kin." Similarly, Baird Callicott, who was deeply influenced by Leopold and played a leading role in founding the field of environmental philosophy, argued similarly. Human beings are kin, literally, to all other kinds of life. Many others have come to similar views without using the word kinship, including Rachel Carson, who presaged the biophilia hypothesis when, in 1954, she suggested that there is an evolutionary root for the love of nature. As she put it, "This affinity of the human spirit for the earth and its beauties is deeply and logically rooted because as human beings, we are part of the whole stream of life." Kinship is indeed expressed and promoted through the senses, through the sciences, and the arts, often in ways that combine these in creative ways, including via science museums, aquariums, documentary films, art exhibitions, and even theme parks. Indeed, close observation of such phenomena demonstrates that when it comes to the perception of interspecies kinship, there's a permeable boundary between the senses, the arts, and the sciences. Indeed, the sciences and arts begin with the senses, and all three seek to understand the world, while the arts and scientists also seek to explain it. E.O. Wilson had a complementary insight when he described artists as expert observers and art itself as a device for exploration and discovery that, among other functions, is able to instruct by pleasing. This idea of art exploring and explaining the world by pleasing the viewer is worth keeping in mind as I examine artistic expressions of kinship at science museums and aquariums. The Hall of Human Origins at New York City's American Museum of Natural History exemplifies how science curators use diverse sculptures, images, and interpretive panels to teach biological kinship. This display shows that given their evolutionary proximity, 98.8% of human DNA is the same as chimpanzees. Another display extended the analysis of family resemblances between humans and chimpanzees to Goliath frogs by showing the similarity between their appendages. The adjacent text stated, "All living things, from people to butterflies to mushrooms, are related to one another. Both humans and birds have eyes, for example." This is a homology, a feature that two different living things inherit from a common ancestor. The adjacent Hall of Biodiversity has many aesthetically pleasing displays of Earth's diverse organisms. One needs little time there to realize that for many visitors, the displays evoke awe and wonder. This venue includes evocative nature-reverencing aphorisms penned by famous scientists, artists, and activists expressing kinship and promoting biodiversity conservation. Near Johannesburg, South Africa, several sites, Sturkfontein, which is also known as the Cradle of Humanity, the adjacent evolution-focused Maropeng theme park, and the Origins Museum at Wits University, all trace the evolutionary story from its beginnings to the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa to the present. At Sturkfontein, visitors are urged to discover their true selves, which means their animal selves, and their kinship with all other human beings. This display describes how we evolved from Australopithecines developed into the genus Homo, and emerged as modern humans some 200,000 years ago, a date that has been pushed back by recent discoveries to about 400,000 years before the present. Evolution thus teaches that we are one species. In South Africa, this was emphasized at each site, no doubt in part to promote interhuman kinship and thus help to overcome the country's racism-fraught history. But the sites also made clear that humans are biologically related to all other living things. The Two Oceans Aquarium in Cape Town, South Africa, presents similar messages. It does so, however, in an overtly spiritual and thus unusual way. Its credo, that the ocean is sacred, greets visitors immediately upon entry, while adjacent banners declare that whales are central to the reawakening of our spiritually connected place within the living universe. Here, kinship is not only with whales, but with the entire living universe. As with many museums around the world, scientific understandings were mixed with calls for conservation and evocative words stressing that we all belong to nature. These ideas were communicated via one of South Africa's most famous and influential figures, Nobel Peace Prize winner and anti-apartheid activist, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Tutu stressed that the African principle of Ubuntu should be understood to enjoin felt kinship among all beings. Astute observers there would also recognize that the curators designed the displays to evoke awe, wonder, and even love for marine life and the biosphere as a whole. Indeed, curators around the world, as shown in this further example from the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California, often seek to arouse feelings of belonging to nature and kinship with all life. The aquarium's entrance exhorts visitors to connect to the animals, plants, and habitats of the bay and to protect Earth's oceans, again through aphorisms from writers and scientists, as here quoting Thoreau's famous statement about wildness preserving the world, combined with Terry Tempest Williams' statement that wildness reminds us of what we are connected to rather than what we are separate from. The aquarium thus promotes a spirituality of belonging and connection to nature. Some of the exhibits are accompanied with mystical music, as is the case where one encounters artistically illuminated jellyfish, and are obviously designed to awaken awe, wonder, and caring for the Earth's wild diversity. The curators even take global their evangelical, quasi-animistic nature religion via their mesmerizing Jellycam. Equally wonder-filling, and thus hard to leave for many, is the aquarium's largest tank. Many documentaries and theatrical films also exemplify how the arts blend kinship feelings with science and conservation. Some of the earliest nature documentaries were produced by Walt Disney. Its Academy Award-winning True Life Adventure series, which began in 1948, blended science with anthropomorphic storytelling. Disney's animated films, including Bambi in 1942, typically often blur the line between humans and other species while urging respect for their habitats. This is, arguably, another way to promote kinship feelings and pro-environmental behavior. And following changes in American culture, some of these have drawn on and portrayed in a positive light indigenous societies as promoting cross-species reciprocity and kinship, such as Pocahontas in 1995 and Brother Bear in 2003. Disney's tradition of documentary filmmaking intensified in 2008 when it launched Disney Nature to foster, as Disney's then CEO put it at the time, greater understanding and appreciation of the beauty and fragility of our natural world. Images at the division's website tugged at the heartstrings, suggesting that Disney nature will reveal bonds between humans and other species in ways that will capture your heart, while also asking plaintively, what would life be without them? One Disney nature executive even claimed that their objective is to teach the intrinsic value of nature. Clearly, they sought to do this not only with science, but with emotion-triggering artistry. A year after the establishment of Disney Nature, James Cameron released Avatar, which metaphorically contended that indigenous peoples have intimate relationships and ethical responsibilities toward all forms of life. The film's call for audiences to wake up and to value all life was reflected in its I See You theme, in Sully's reflection on his own awakening, and in the film's final moment when Sully's eyes suddenly and widely opened, as if to an entirely new consciousness. And although Avatar was not produced by Disney, Cameron and Disney's creatives collaborated to create Pandora, the world of Avatar, a domain within Disney's Animal Kingdom theme park, which opened in 2017. There and throughout the animal kingdom, in a variety of artistic ways, kinship and conservation take center stage. Indeed, rising to the height of 44 meters at the very center of the animal kingdom is a sculpture modeled after the African baobab tree, which is sometimes referred to as the African tree of life. Into its trunk and branches, 325 animals have been sculpted into limbs, wings, and other body parts, and they are entangled in a way that suggests interconnection and kinship. Jane Goodall, who had been invited to tour the kingdom on the cusp of its opening, was greatly moved by the symbolism. When she searched the massive sculpture for a chimpanzee, however, she could not find the species with which she felt special kinship. Noting her reaction, the artists labored overnight, adding Goodall's favorite chimp, shown here, just in time for the park's opening. As problematic as some of the artistic creations I have described may be, and they have had their critics, it's clear that their producers have sought to express and promote kinship sentiments and values that cohere with them. I have sought to highlight the entanglement of the senses, arts, and sciences in the experience, expression, and promotion of perceptions of biological kinship. I've also paid special attention to how, for many, the sciences can lead to or reinforce such sentiments and the biodiversity reverencing values that cohere with them. Coming to an understanding of our intrinsic relatedness to all life leaves unanswered many moral questions. These include how our obligations differ between near, distant, and future relatives, human and not. But as evolutionary theory teaches, human beings share a cognitive and emotional repertoire, which includes the capacity for biophilia and kinship feelings. For some, such understandings and sentiments provide a moral benchmark for compassionate and critical ethical analysis. If such perceptions, sentiments, and values were to grow and become a significant proportion of the human community, we might just find a path toward healthy and resilient socio-ecological systems. As a scholar, I am, foremost, an analyst of nature-human relations, fascinated with the ways people do or do not connect with nature and how this shapes their lives and the living systems to which they belong. I'm reticent to talk about myself, in part because I do not want to take the focus off of my interlocutors, as well as because my experiences are personal and sometimes even weirdly intimate. This reticence acknowledged, as one who is insatiably curious about the experiences of others, I understand the curiosity of others about the writers behind words. I know, moreover, that knowing something about writers can be useful when evaluating their credibility and claims. It may also be that the sorts of experiences I will presently describe have made me especially alert to the perceptions of kinship in others. I did write personally in the epilogue of Dark Green Religion when I acknowledged my affinity for certain streams of the phenomena I had examined. Several years later, I was asked to write about my journey to ecocentrism, which I did with greater trepidation because in that essay I went into some personal and sometimes embarrassing detail. I even, in another essay, described an experience of communion with trees that made me wonder whether I had an overly active imagination or an archetypal animistic perception of tree consciousness. I have not, however, written about or publicly discussed a number of other experiences I have had that have led me to consider the possibility of interspecies communication, communion, and even of cross-species kinship. I will limit my focus to experiences within marine ecosystems, wherein I spent much of my life. On the due date of our first child, my wife and I were swimming outside the surf line off of the Southern California coast. She was pregnant and already past due. Suddenly, we were surrounded by a pod of dolphins. They swam with us for a while, whistling and singing. It seemed to us as though they recognized that another swimming mammal would soon give birth. Were they, in their own ways, excited for us, welcoming the new one to their watery world? Decades later, I would learn that female dolphins sing to their babies in the womb, which renewed my wonderings. I once thought I knew sea lions and their behavior fairly well because I had often been around California sea lions while working as a lifeguard along Southern California's coast. During an expedition in the Galapagos Islands, however, I once found myself amidst a large group of their Galapagos relatives. Not only did I swim with them, but as I dove and twirled, they did that and much more, with ridiculous speed, agility, and grace. These were young sea lions. Perhaps they had not previously encountered this strange, oddly colored, and relatively clumsy semi-aquatic mammal. Were they curious, showing off? Were they having fun playing with me? Was I just imagining that we were playing together? I have twice been to the Hawaiian Islands. On the first occasion, I happened to run into a young man I used to work with in California who welcomed me to his beach house and lent me his water toys. When I arrived at his house, I saw whale spouts far offshore. Excited, I grabbed a kayak and paddled probably more than 1.5 miles out to where I stopped a few hundred yards from them, quietly watching. After a while, with no warning, a humpback whale surfaced so close to me that it displaced a large volume of water, causing my small craft to rise and fall. I saw the whale looking at me and had that eye-to-eye experience that many have reported and found to be profound and, in some cases, life-changing. I immediately realized that I had been visited by a great presence with an intelligence exotic to me, but who was likely curious about what a human was doing so far offshore in that little boat. Or was that perception in my imagination? On the second occasion I visited these islands, I had an uncanny experience of swimming with a young sea turtle. It's not unusual, of course, for humans to swim near and sometimes alongside sea turtles. Usually, however, they seem indifferent to our visitations. This encounter was different. I ended up swimming for a long time with the young paddler. When I would dive down and cruise alongside, the turtle would often rise when I did for air, as if it wished to stay in formation. As the time lengthened, I wondered if more than curiosity was involved. Was the turtle feeling something akin to companionship? I certainly enjoyed its company. For a good reason, namely epistemological humility, Western science warns against anthropomorphism. Consequently, I tend to be skeptical about my own imaginings of what other organisms might be thinking, feeling, or communicating. Nevertheless, many evolutionary scientists and ethologists are challenging assumptions that draw firm boundaries between our own cognitive and affective traits and those of other species. It may be that if we can open up our full perceptual repertoire, affectively and rationally, to the possibility of communication and connection with non-human species, that it will be easier to grasp our kinship with them. It could be that cultivating alertness to the liveliness of the world is the surest way to kinship.